kohea, tērā maunga e tū maira. E ko Taranaki pēr, nuku mai, neke mai, ki taku tauaro kikini ai eha. Aha, ke noa, ke noa. Nau mai e te iwi whakatau mai ki tēnei whakaputanga kōrero mo tō tātou maunga i te pōnei. E ringo te aroha ki au koutou e no ake nei o koutou kāinga i tēnā pito, i tēnā pito o te motu. Tēnei ka huringa o kāro ki ngā mate o te wā, tēnei uki ka huringa o kāro ki tēnei wāanga o te tau, kuia tērā ko te poroporo ake i te tau kua hipa, a me te aroa no te tiro ki te tau e tū mai nei. I runga no i tērā kōrero, ka me i ake rā ki ngā mate o te tau, o te wiki o te marama. Haere ake rā koutou, ki tua o te pō o ki ai. Ka huri ake nei o tātou whakaaro, a ki tēnei wātonu. Uti rā ki te tini o ngā mai e pākawe nei e koutou i tēnei wātonu, tēnei he mi ina te ngākau, ia māuko Liana, ai tēnei pō. Nau mai e rarau ki tō tātou papa kōrero, ki tō tātou whakaputanga kōrero. Nau mai oki ki te korimako e kōkō nei o na kōrero, ia pō, ia wiki, ia marama. Tēnei e mihi ake nei ki a koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou. Tēnei ka hoatu ki a koe rā Elia.
Tēnā tātou, tēnā koe he mi nau whakatuwhera tō tātou nei kōrero, tō tātou nei wānanga te pōnei, tēnā koutou e ngā uri o Taranaki Maunga. Ko Liana Pautua hau, ko au tētihi o ngā māngai mō ngā iwi, i wainganui ngā kōrero i te karauna mō tō tātou nei maunga, ko Hemi tētihi anō, ko Jamie Tuta, tō tātou kaiarahi i roto i era o ngā mai, engari, i tau mai te kohu ki rungi a Tāmaki Makaurau i tēnei rā, kei te haere tonu mai a Jamie, ki wainganui a tātou i tēnei pō engari kare roa, ka kite i aia hoki, nā reira tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora everybody, thank you for joining us for a Maunga Negotiations update presentation. Just introducing ourselves, Liana Pautu, Hemi Sundgren, and we'll be joined shortly by Jamie Tuta, and we've been leading out on some of the mahi in terms of the Maunga negotiations between the Crown. So we're going to take you through an update presentation. The purpose of this is that we're getting close to finalising the parameters of an agreement with the Crown for redress over our tupuna. And so we thought that it's an opportune time to provide some updates to our people before we initial that. And also we'll be having a ratification process. We'll talk about that later on in terms of our people being able to determine whether we've negotiated a good package or not near him. So just apologies from Jamie. He got caught up in the Auckland fog today, and so his flight was delayed. He's on his way to join us shortly. But I think we'll just kick off into our presentation. So that's us with our Maunga negotiations. We're going to go through some background. We'll do a little bit of go through the historical review, and then we'll get into the negotiation process and the package that we've negotiated essentially. So our update review sets out there what we're going to do tonight. We're going to talk about some of the next steps, where we go to from here in terms of the negotiations, and then we'll get in. We'll have an opportunity for pārtai. So, if throughout the presentation you have pārtai, we should be able to see them as they're coming through. So throw up the pārtai, and we'll try and answer them as we go through the presentation. And if not, there'll be time at the end where we'll open up for pārtai. So we'll go through there. So let's get into the presentation. There's the overview in terms of what we are going to cover off today. Main thing is really the negotiations framework and an overview of the package that we have been negotiated. So I'll just get into some of the background. Many of you will be familiar with the treaty settlement process that each of our 8 iwi have gone through. And so as a part of those deeds of settlement with each of the 8 iwi of Taranaki, within those deeds of settlements essentially was a clause that said that redress for the Maunga would be negotiated separately and collectively with the 8 iwi. So essentially the claims over the national park, over our tupuna maunga, were settled as a part of our individual iwi deeds of settlement, but the redress for the confiscation and taking of our tupuna weren't provided for in our deeds of settlement. So this is the package that we're negotiating. It's not a full treaty settlement like our iwi settlements, but it's one to look at redress specific to our tupuna maunga. And so that's how we landed where we've landed in terms of collectively negotiating that. So when we started, moving on to our principles, our kaupapa, so when the 8 iwi sat down and agreed to enter into negotiations together, we had to come up with a set of principles really that we would work by. So if we just go to the next slide, we've got our kaupapa and our principles set out there. These will be very familiar to you all in terms of mana motu hake, te tirohanga roa, mahitahi, especially when you've got the 8 iwi working together to try and negotiate this package. Manaakitanga pono, good faith. It's always hard to keep good faith when you're in negotiations with the Crown. And also, being tika and transparent in the things that we do. So part of this, a number of you would have heard presentations and updates from us in various spaces. And I guess that's been important for us to make sure that we're letting people know what we're doing.
Yeah, so Liana, just further to that, as Liana may have said before, we started this process in 2016. And so I remember our early conversations, Leo, where we had, we were meeting with all of our, we did want to make sure, and I'm just looking at that first principle there, that we did want to make sure that each year we had an element of, that this settlement wouldn't undermine the authority that each and every iwi had with respect to the negotiations. And so, we wanted to make sure that people were forward-looking to be able to achieve what the feeling was at the time in terms of succeeding with the negotiation process. Nothing happens without collaboration. And of course, there's this value and principle about we have to give to receive in terms of reciprocity and manaakitanga. And we wanted to make sure, I think that last one was something we've maintained right along this process, Liana, is that we wanted a no surprises approach, not just with our iwi, respective iwi boards, but across the iwi, hence our kōrero here today. We wanted to, we've tried to maintain a consistent, open and transparent process where we could constantly come back to or use the platform such as the Korimako has to kind of talk through where we're landing. So these principles have held true to us right from that time, Liana, haven't they?
Yeah. And, where some of you will be thinking, wait, you started in 2016, where it's 6 years later. But essentially, we took a little bit of a break in the middle. We couldn't get agreement with the Crown on some key aspects. And so we decided to step back from negotiations at that point. And it was also the time of the general election. And so we stepped back, took a breather, and then re-engaged with the Crown to see if we could get a package over the line. And so in part, that's a little bit of why it's taken a little longer for us to get to this point. Ka pai. It's really good to perhaps take us back and look at some of, I guess, the starting point for our negotiations. So when we think of a negotiation, we think everybody's starting on an even foot. We're going into these negotiations equal and we have the same base or platform to work from. But But actually that wasn't the case for us when we went and entered into these negotiations. So essentially the Crown, it was probably our first negotiation meeting. There were 5 parameters that were brought to the table. One was that the National Parks Act would continue to apply, and that Taranaki, Tongariro, Wanganui National Parks would be, would as a collective would continue to be administered under that regime. Arrangements for public access, conservation, recreation, all of those values would still exist, or they had to be maintained in whatever we negotiated. And I guess the third thing to that was that the arrangements must be fit for purpose and durable. So we had to look at, I guess, the governance arrangements, how they were consistent with how other national parks had been treated in other treaty settlements, how the arrangements that we negotiate might be consistent with existing legislation or treaty policy parameters. So you can see just from those first 3, we were operating within a certain kind of within parameters that the Crown were quite strong on. The last 2 that were put on the table for us was that, the arrangements needed to respond to iwi aspirations. So and this is something that we supported too, that there had to be a role for and recognition of our iwi in relation to national parks. So that was probably, of the 5, that was one that we understood and supported. And then the last parameter that was put on the table when we entered into negotiations was that te ure wera would not be replicated. So with te ure wera, what you have is te ure wera is not under the National Parks Act framework, and it has governance arrangements that and operational arrangements that don't necessarily involve the Department of Conservation. So we were told right from the outset that those kinds of arrangements wouldn't be available to us. And so I guess it's important to lay out that background, because some people are aware of te ure wera and they look at that and they say, why don't we get that? And this is the reason why. So these are the parameters that we entered into negotiations on. And if we just look at the map, taking us to the next slide, we've got a map there that shows exactly what we're talking about. So the national park as it is essentially the lands that we are negotiating redress over. We understand and know that our tupuna maunga go beyond the extent of those boundaries for the national park. But, we had to be really clear about what land might be on offer in terms of creating a redress package and mechanism. And I know, some people have sort of said, oh, actually, how does this all work? Are we negotiating everything? And we know that some of our waterways start in the national park and they flow out. We know that Paritutu probably should be included as a part of Te Kāhui Tupua. And we've just been trying to navigate the negotiations within those parameters that I set out. So the basis of our negotiations is the whenua that is encompassed in the existing national park plan. And if we just quickly, before I hand over to Hemi to talk about some of the historical stuff, is looking at the process that we've been through. Quite similar. If we go to the next slide, the process that we follow is quite similar to iwi, the iwi treaty settlements. And where we're at, it's circled in red there, is we're negotiating the collective redress deeds. So we had the mandate recognised, we entered into the terms of negotiation, and then we went through an aspirations sort of piece of work to understand what the iwi aspirations were for negotiations. And then we signed a record of understanding, He Anga Pūtake Rongo. So that document's available online through the Te Arawhiti site if anyone hasn't had a look at it and wants to. And where we got to in that, we kind of had already negotiated and agreed the framework. What we've been doing under this collective redress process is essentially negotiating all the technicalities. So we agreed in principle what we were trying to do, which we'll talk about shortly. And that's in the record of understanding in He Anga Pūtake Rongo. But what we've been negotiating recently is how to make all of that happen in a technical sense, how to lock in all of those things that we'd agreed in principle and how to make them work. So that's been the bulk of the mahi over the last sort of 12 to 18 months, I'd say. But I'll hand over to you, Hemi. We'll come back to the process so you know what the next steps are. But I'll hand over to Hemi to talk a little bit about the historical component of the negotiations.
I better come off mute. Next slide, please, Mata. Kapai, next slide, please. So, of course, the basis of any kind of discussion and negotiation with the Crown does need to be based on a sound kind of historic or understanding of what happened in the past. And so that's no different to this case, whereby we have not dived but assessed quite in detail the extent of the disruption and alienation of Taranaki Maunga over a period of time. A lot of the kōrero have come out of previous iwi settlements deeds, which some of you may recognise. But more importantly, we did a little bit more extra research to find out the kind of historic detail around the level of disruption and how Taranaki Maunga was alienated from our people over a period of how many years now. So many of you on this call will be kind of intimately aware of some of the historic reference points. So I'll just go through them kind of in high level. But in short, like disruption began for iwi and Taranaki with the New Zealand Settlements Act in 1865, for which Taranaki was proclaimed to be a part of the Middle Taranaki district. And if you've read any of the iwi historical accounts, there's some great detail in there. And when this historic account comes out, you'll also see some of the detail in this account with respect to our tupuna. In 1875 was another key date because that's when the provincial government declared the ring around our maunga, as Liana alluded to before, as a forest reserve for temporarily, maintaining the integrity of the maunga at that point. But by 1881, what really drove the designation of a forest reserve over that, what we call the ring plain, was primarily led by and founded on this notion of development. And in this case, there seemed to be quite a bit of timber growing up in and around our tupuna slopes. So the primary reason for which the Egmont Forest Reserve was designated and permanently under the Lands Act was for the growth and preservation of timber, primarily to drive development across the region. By 1895, of course, there was a real burgeoning fur industry, and there was a lot of opportunity for export of possum fur. So I think my recollection is that 8 possums were liberated onto the mountain forest reserve, and I'm not sure which bright spark decided that, but many of you will know that we're spending millions and millions of dollars in today's times to get rid of possums. So it may have been a great decision for some at the time, but it's become a real pest for us at the moment. And of course, the Egmont National Park was established in 1900 after lobbying from the Taranaki Scenic Preservation Society. And of course, the Egmont National Park at that point in time kind of had a bit of an impact on some of our customary activities during that time. A little bit different today, but we'll talk about that a little bit further on. Another key date is, of course, possum hunting became quite an important source for revenue across the park. And that happened right up until 1943, but that's changed somewhat today. Next slide, please. So a little bit more further to this disruption and alienation. National Parks Amendment Act came into play in 1924, as I said, had an impact on some of our customary activities. 1920s tourism. I think there were upwards of 3,000, over 3,000 people directly accessing the Maunga slopes at that point in time. And we say that did have a direct bearing and impact on some of our customary sites, because during this period we see some of the old names on particular sites that our old people used and frequented fall off maps. And so we've addressed that during the negotiation to reinstigate and reformalise some of those names, and Liana will touch on those at some point through the redress piece. And so tourism, in short, had quite a bit of an impact because we start to see the generation and investment into infrastructure. So there were a lot of walking tracks, there were a lot of alpine clubs emerging, and other different kind of tourist type activities, and that did have quite a bearing and impact on our maunga. Goats and possums gradually accepted as pests, and so you can start to see the turnaround now of the impact of having goats and possums in the park to this piece of work becoming incentivised around hunting. So 1952 also represents a key part in the history of our maunga, whereby a new national parks kind of regime came into being that changed the governance structure of the board. At that point in time, had a direct bearing on our people's ability to provide and informed decisions over the park, either from a customary basis or from general management perspective. So another process whereby our people were alienated from making decisions over our tupuna. By 1977, obviously, there's another amendment to the Parks Act, which at this time, after successive petitions by the Taranaki Māori Trust Board, which some of you will be aware of, right back prior to the formation of the Trust Board, actually, to the 1880s, right through to the formation of the Trust Board in 1931, ongoing into the 1970s, the Trust Board and all members prior to the formation of the Trust Board were petitioning the government to address the alienation of Taranaki Maunga, particularly around things such as the naming of Taranaki Maunga, that the name was not Egmont, it was Taranaki, around our people's ability to access the Maunga, make decisions over the Maunga, and such like. And that the Maunga provided a source of identity for our people and for the region, and that our people needed to be involved in its management, its governance, and it needed to carry the name that was bestowed upon it since time immemorial. So things like that were spoken to in detail in the historical account. And of course, the imposition of the Mount Egmont Vesting Act that was passed and created significant stress and pressure on different communities, and obviously the Trust Board. And some of you who were around during that time will know the impact that had. The Mount Egmont simply, I'll leave you to read the historical account, because it is a bit of a long story. And of course, through the work of the Taranaki Trust Board and those involved at the time, there was a decision to name the mountain, give the mountain a dual name. So the community wasn't ready at that point, and some of you will may remember some of the kind of newspaper headlines coming out during that time, that they weren't happy about Egmont being removed, and so the government at the time obviously said, well, we'll go with the dual name. That's now changed. The name Egmont will be removed going forward as a part of this negotiation. And of course, we all know that the Department of Conservation was established in 1987, which took over full management of the park under the National Parks Act and framework. And of course, we have successive conservation law reforms over a period of time, which abolished prior governance structure over the national park and instigated a new kind of dual layered management and governance regime, which is currently in place, and that takes the form of a National Parks Conservation Authority and regional conservation authorities, with which Liana and a few others involved in our iwi space are currently members on. So all of these things are touched on in the historical account and will be addressed in some way through the negotiation, Liana? Sorry, it's a bit of a whirlwind, but hopefully it gives you a broad overview of the key things that we touch on through the historical account and will be made available to everyone soon. Okay, that's me, I think.
Yeah, just picking up on, we're seeing some of the chat. I agree. The Mount Egmont Vesting Act, it hurt more than those directly involved in terms of the trust board membership. It was a significant event, which is why we're trying to address that in these negotiations to try and, I guess, not, we can't turn back the clock on that, but we can acknowledge the mamai that it caused in some way through these negotiations. So definitely doing that, Uncle Peter, or looking to do that. If we just move on now to the next slide, we're going to go into the key aspects that we've negotiated under the settlements. So what we describe here is he kawa tupua. And Hemi, do you want to just give a quick overview in terms of why we chose this as our framework?
Yeah, early on in the piece, we wanted to try and come to have our own framework for negotiation. So we wanted to make sure that certain aspects associated with the nature of the mountain were reflected in the way that we negotiated redress. So what we wanted to do was develop we say a framework, and I hope people understand what that means, but key pillars to our framework and how we went into the negotiation process was to make sure that we addressed these things or assessed any redress that was negotiated or proposed to be negotiated against these two pillars, basically. The two pillars, those being te mana o ngā maunga and te mana o te kāhui. Te mana o ngā maunga, in short, basically sought to recognise and promote and protect the health and well-being of the maunga and their status as tupuna. And none of you will be surprised to know that we wanted to make sure that we viewed the mountain, we made sure the Crown viewed the mountain in light of the fact that they were tupuna. And so we went into discussions, and we continue to have discussions based on the fact that the Crown recognises and promotes the well-being of our mountains as tupuna. And so Liana will talk a little bit further about the types of redress that give effect to that particular piece. And of course, the maunga don't stand alone. And so we wanted to make sure that the next piece around negotiation was directly reflects the importance of our relationship as descendants of Taranaki maunga with them. And so the next part or next pillar to that redress framework was around recognising and providing for the mana and the relationship of ngā iwi o Taranaki to our tupuna. So in short, key thing is that redress recognises our tupuna, our maunga as tupuna, and their health and well-being is paramount. And the next part of that, obviously, is recognising the relationship that ngā iwi o Taranaki have with our tupuna, and that these things go hand in hand. Hope that helps, Liana.
Yeah, ka pai him. So when we've been going through the negotiation process, everything that we've negotiated essentially sits within this framework, and it either sits under te mana o ngā maunga or te mana o te kāhui. So it's either a redress mechanism that's about the health and well-being of our tupuna and their status as tupuna, or it's a redress mechanism ensures that the relationship we have as uri, ngā iwi o Taranaki, has to our tupuna. So that's really that's just important to set out. So this is how we've approached the negotiation. So if I take you to the next slide, actually, if we can skip through, this is really, I'm going to talk about the arrangements under Te Mano o Ngā Maunga. So there's a bit of a list there, and I'll go through them. Tēnā koe, Jamie. No, Mike, ki waingani ia tātou. So I'll just go through some of the key points under He Aronga ki te Mano o Ngā Maunga. So the first is, and going back to the point we talked about before, is repealing the Mount Egmont Vesting Act. So essentially, when you repeal legislation, it no longer exists. It gets taken out completely, which certainly was an aspiration of many of our people when we spoke to them. I've got a double up of that, but that's all right. We're definitely going to do that. We are recognising, we're establishing legal person or legal personality over our tupuna. And because there are a number of maunga, a number of tupuna within the area of the national park, rather than but we decided to find a name that covered all of those tupuna so that they're all covered under the one legal personality rather than having to go through a process of giving them all individual legal personalities. So Te Kāhui Tupua is where we've landed in terms of how we're going to refer to those tupuna as a collective. A lot of discussion happened about this in terms of we were trying not to. We knew that perhaps our whanaunga in the central North Island might want to use Te Kāhui Maunga. Others have used it. We were trying to ensure that we had a phrase that or a collective name for that collective group that nobody else was using and nobody else would get upset over. Essentially, I think that's how we looked at it when we were coming up with that. What will happen with Te Kāhui Tupua? So Te Kāhui Tupua will become a legal person, and so from that, the national park land that we talked about in that map will all be vested in Te Kāhui Tupua. So one of the key aspirations for us when we went into the negotiations was that the Crown would no longer own our tupuna. And so, and we didn't believe necessarily that we needed to own our tupuna either. And so we've negotiated an arrangement where they own themselves. And so all of the national park land will be vested in them. Certain minerals will also be vested in Te Kāhui Tupua. So there's a long list of Crown minerals in terms of if you find certain minerals within your land, there are a list of minerals that are deemed to be owned by the Crown. And so there's a list of those. Some of them off the top of my head, Jamie Kōkōwai, which is going to be one of them that will vest in Te Kāhui Tupua. Pākohe will be. Do you remember them all, Jamie? I can't think of them off the top of my head.
Andesite.
Andesite. I can't think of them, but there's a list of the minerals that are going to be vested in Kāhui Tupua. So essentially, if any of those minerals are found within the boundaries of the national park, they will automatically be owned by Te Kāhui Tupua as opposed to the Crown as it is in many situations on private land. And that's something that we've been working hard to negotiate with the Crown to get over the line. There's also another aspect in terms of the interim custodianship of taonga tūturu. So any taonga tūturu that is found on private land essentially goes through a Māori Land Court process to determine the ownership, and there's often an interim custodian. What we've negotiated is that any taonga found within the national park boundary will automatically vest in Te Kāhui Tupua until that custodianship is resolved. So usually there's a bit of a process to determine who the interim custodian is, but in this instance, within the national park, they will automatically vest in Te Kāhui Tupua until a process is gone through. And we've also negotiated the ability for Te Kāhui Tupua to own assets. So as a legal person, as legal people, you and I can own assets. We can hold cash, we can own land. And so we negotiated that our tupuna should be able to do the exact same thing. So if someone passed and they had a will and they wanted to vest or bequeath some pūtea or some land to our tupuna, they could do so. And so we're still working through some of the technicalities on that space, but definitely that's a big win for us in terms of being able to own and hold lands and assets that sit outside of the national park, knowing that everything that's held by Te Kāhui Tupua is to be applied for the well-being, health and well-being of our tupuna. So in terms of Te Mano o Ngā Maunga, that's kind of an overview of the key aspects of it. And then I guess the next slide, if we go to those, I don't know, Hemi, Jamie, I want to hand you over to the naming.
Yep, I can have a go while Jamie sorts his audio. So as I said before, a lot of the names during the early kind of late 1800s and early 1900s started to fall off the kind of formal maps. And so we, through the process, had a bit of a dialogue with other iwi to see if there were other names that they wanted to kind of have reformed or kind of reformalized. But we've started with these names basically on this map. There is a further process for other iwi should they wish to have other names formalized through the Geographic Board. But we've started with this list of names here as the basis for our negotiation, basically. So as Liana said, we've through the process, we've sought to have the formal name of the national park changed from Egmont National Park. That will cease to exist and will now be known as Te Papakura Taranaki. And as Jamie said early on in previous presentations, Te Papa meaning an area of significance and Kura meaning something of quite a very, very high value. And of course, Taranaki, which represents the broader the broader region and national park. So the new formal name for the national park will be Te Papakura Taranaki. It will not have an English equivalent. Further names were as listed on this map. Pauakai will be formally known as Pauakai. We've put macrons on it. Patuha will be formalised. Kaitake will be formalised. New names new names to be known. Mangoraukaua fell off the maps in the late 1800s and was known as Lake Dive. We've sought to have Mangoraukaua put back on the landscape. Te Ahu Kawakawa will be formalised. Te Rere o Tahurangi, which is known as Bell's Falls, where Francis Dillon Bell named the falls, or were named after him. That is now known as Te Rere o Tahurangi. And of course, Te Tahu no Tūtawa will also be formalised. Used to be known as Warwick's Castle. And Jamie, you probably have a bit to add here.
Oh, ka pai. So, kei te rongo koutou iau. Yeah, and I think so. The objective here, I mean, if you track back and if you look at the history of the Maunga, what you have is basically the imposition of new names upon our landscape and our tupuna, which no doubt Hemi sort of discussed, recognising particular non-Māori who had sort of some connection to various parts of the Maunga. So this is very much the initial phase. The objective we've really had is about reinstating our reo. And so you'll see one of the key themes here is, which we pushed very hard with Doc and others and the Crown, is, for too long, we've always had to translate our names. And, Te Rere o Tahurangi is an example where Te Rere means the falls, Tahurangi, of course, that particular tupuna. And we said we're not going to call it Te Rere o Tahurangi Falls because that's doubling up. But what you'll see here, and as Hemi sort of said, Te Papakura o Taranaki, Te Kahui Tupua, recognising those names, which are our names formally, and then, of course, the Maunga Taranaki. Critically here, we have Taranaki Maunga, so it's not Taranaki Maunga / Mount Taranaki, it's Taranaki Maunga, which I think it will be the first in the country, and from our perspective is the start of much more reclamation in terms of our ingoa, our tupuna, and I think this map here really for me is one of the real important pieces, because it's a process of reclamation of our reo and of our names, that will be very much normalised. And although it hasn't formally become Te Papakura o Taranaki, I mean, you might read newspaper articles, a lot of people and even some of our doc staff locally are referring to the national park now as Te Papakura o Taranaki. So I think, initially when we were exploring this, of course, there was always fear. How are people going to say it? And, this is quite radical. But certainly from our perspective, it's about putting a po in the ground and normalising our reo.
I think the media have started applying that name too, Jamie.
Yeah. But yeah, just, and as Hemi said, there are other opportunities. One of the other elements here that we've really pushed for is what we call the Maunga values, or ngā pou tupua. And really the values speak about, our understanding and reflect our worldview, our ways of knowing in terms of our connection, our relationship to our maunga, and what they mean to us collectively, but also their scope there around how these values reflect our individuality as particular iwi and hapu. And I think that's one of the other themes throughout this, recognising that we've come together as a collective of 8. And one of the objectives has also been has been to recognise the diversity which exists among us collectively as 8 iwi, but also, of course, within our iwi, our hapu narratives, kōrero, and how those connections link back to the maunga. Part of the whole process of recognising our tupuna as a legal person is you've got to have a status statement. And the status statement really describes our maunga. And when you read this sort of statement here, indivisible and living whole from the peaks through to the surrounding lands, you'd be amazed how long it took to negotiate this simple statement. Because from our perspective, we view our maunga very much as our tupuna, and so he tupuna tonu, so they're alive and they're living. When we talk about an indivisible whole, one of the challenges we have is that from the outset of negotiations, the Crown, we're very much thinking about, the negotiations are restricted to the national park boundaries. And we said, well, the national park boundary is an artificial, it's not a line that we've drawn. And actually, when you look at the broader context of Te Kahui Tupua, which are all of the peaks that form part of the personality, the peaks actually extend beyond the national park boundaries. And so that's what this sort of covers off. It recognises that Te Kahui Tupua as an indivisible and living whole from the peaks. So whether that be from Taranaki, Pauakai, Kaitake and the like, sort of move beyond, go from the peaks down to the surrounding lands. And, how wide and how far, what's the extent of the surrounding lands. But I guess from our perspective, what it provides is scope, and it also, around our maunga, but it also provides the opportunity for our tupuna to have standing in particular matters, whether they be consenting matters, legal matters, that may have an impact or an effect on Te Kāhui Tupua, Te Papakura o Taranaki, and basically the arrangements that we've negotiated. So that's that. And, the Maunga values, and you'll see this within the broader arrangements, they sit alongside the national park purposes. And I don't know if you touched on this, Liana, but, early on in the piece when the Crown came to us with these 5 or 6 constraints and parameters that we're operating within, that's quite confronting, because it's, well, actually we're here to negotiate the best arrangements for our tupuna and for our people. But what we found going through the process is there are elements within the current National Parks Act and its purposes that very much align with our worldview. The challenge, of course, is the fact that they sit within a legal framework and a regulatory framework that hasn't really included us in any decision making and in any sort of management in any meaningful way. So they'll sit alongside, and what we've sort of come to probably agree, haven't we, Liana, Hemi, is that they are sort of mutual, and they sort of complement one another. And Peter, you've just had when we think about Te Kāhui Maunga as a whole, it does actually extend to ngā motu, to paritutu, and I think many of us who understand the narratives and the history of our maunga, paritutu kuia te tuakana. Quite interesting. Our own narratives sort of support the science that paritutu being the older, and then as you come along to Taranaki, and then of course to Panitahi being the youngest. But yes, so when you talk about the surrounding lands, it's very much been inclusive of paritutu, Peter, and there are some other sort of aspects that we've been working through, and that's really in relation to the MACA claims. And that's just something that we haven't finalised yet, but just making sure that when talking about the sort of status statement, understanding what the implications are, because if it does extend out to that coastal area, just making sure being clear about what the legal parameters are. And the final point there is, we've got an existing management plan, and that's part of the National Parks Act, that a national park must have a management plan. Our management plan on the Maunga is very much out of date, and has literally been collecting dust. And so there's an opportunity through these new arrangements to have a management plan that better reflects our worldview, the Maunga values, and what we want to see and what we don't want to see, by ensuring that the management plan is consistent with the values. And one of the other pieces is what is called a conservation management strategy, which at a regional level sort of talks about those key conservation objectives and conservation objectives throughout the region. And so for the purposes of those aspects and elements of the conservation management strategy that speak to or reference Te Papakura o Taranaki and Te Kāhui Tupua, the plan must be consistent with the values. And so, we see the values as being a really critical piece in recognising sort of our worldview, our ways of being and knowing, and how we can influence the arrangements going forward. Because every meeting, Liana is very firm on this, that it's for ngā iwi o Taranaki to determine and interpret these particular Maunga values, and not some dock official or some other non-Māori individual, because they don't have the understanding of these particular values.
So it's worth us. We're going to go through those Maunga values now and spend a little bit of time talking through them. And the main reason is because these Maunga values underpin all of the arrangements that we are negotiating. And so everything that occurs within the national park have to be consistent with these values. And I see you talk the question there about the regional council. Essentially, if they are undertaking any mahi within the confines of the national park, or in respect of Te Kāhui Tupua, then the regional council will have to be consistent. Whatever they do will have to be consistent with these values. And that goes for district councils, it goes for the Department of Conservation, it goes, speaks to concessionaires, anybody undertaking any activity that impacts te kahui tupua will have to be consistent with these values. So we'll go through them so that you get a feel for where we're going with this. So who's going to lead off on this? Jay.
Kia ora. So I think as is sort of set out on this particular slide, and the objective here was to ensure that any decisions or any arrangements relating to te kahui tupu and te papa kura o Taranaki reflected us, in short. And so the way we do that is by ensuring that we have a set of these intrinsic values which speak to our worldview and which reflect the way in which we see our maunga, how we connect and relate to our maunga. And so these values are very much based on whakataukitanga kōrero or kōrero whakawai. So, foundational sort of statements and narratives of our tupuna. And so we've sort of not repurposed, but we've drawn on this sort of wisdom and knowledge to guide these arrangements going forward. So the first one there, ko te kahui tupua, he rārangi maunga, here anuku, here arangi, which really speaks to that. I think it's a much more eloquent way of describing the status statement, because when we think about our maunga, they and binding heaven and earth, but actually they connect us to both the physical and metaphysical, or the tangible and intangible elements of who we are as a region because of those physical attributes, but also, of course, as a people. And so in simple terms, how do you apply this? Because I know many may be on listening in tonight to say, wow, so what do you do with the statement? But I think what the statement reinforces is that anything that is done on te kahui tupua within te papakura or Taranaki or adjacent to, that may have an impact or an effect, you need to think about what those impacts, what those effects are. And so, so what this statement does is really tries to capture, all of those particular aspects that, and actions and activities that may have an effect on our tupuna.
Perhaps if I move on to the next one, ko te kahui tupua koia ko o mātou nei oki okinga, ko mātou nei tō rātou oki okitanga. A lot of people are, we've talked about this. I know Hemi and Jamie talked about some of these whakataukitanga kōrero in he Kohu Ka Rewa series they did on Te Kore Mako. But essentially, if you are familiar with the saying, ko au te awa ko te awa ko au, then essentially this is our way of saying that about us of Taranaki and our tupuna. So what we're pretty much saying is that our maunga are us and we are our maunga, and that, both in all senses of that phrase. So whether it be in life or death, we are so interconnected because we are one and the same. And I guess the importance of, when we look at how activities and operations are done in accordance with this particular value, it's really recognizing that intrinsic relationship that we have, that interconnectedness. So essentially, if something affects te kahui tupua, it affects us as uri, and vice versa. And so when someone is looking at how they are consistent with this, it's that they are treating us the way they would treat our maunga. They're treating our maunga as they would treat us as descendants of it. Yeah. Ka pai. Kei a koe Hem.
Next slide, yeah. Ka pai, so this particular whakawai draws from the whakawai kōrero that have emerged from Pariaka over a period of time, and primarily speak to us. We've recontextualized them in the respect that they, we've applied them to our maunga. in that our maunga have become a source of our well-being and regional identity. And so, as Jamie said before, these values will be incorporated to ensure that any activity that takes place on and in around the Papakura o Taranaki, and particularly on the slopes of our tupuna, that they are assessed in line with our regional identity. This also speaks to the importance that the maunga are just not geographic features, but they have influenced and continue to be the source of our whakapapa and our relationship to the maunga. So when we apply this in context of and align it to potential or possible activities that might take place on the maunga, they might be applied against how we view or how a particular activity impacts on our regional identity. It impacts on the source of us and our relationship with the maunga, the source of our culture and the way that we do things. So this values particularly speaks to that. Yeah.
And it's and all of these values. So just looking at some of the questions which we'll come to around the role of DOC. We've got a slide on that, and then a question around tourism. But effectively, when you think about these particular values and you develop a management plan, the management plan itself will need to reflect and speak to these elements. And so what you might see here is it really positions iwi to have greater influence, both in the sort of decision-making and assessment of impacts and effects, but also thinking about which of these activities are actually supporting the health and well-being or the identity or the connection of iwi to the maunga. And we'll talk a little bit later around concessions and sort of, how these values might impact concession decisions, but also some of the recent case law, which out of the Ngaitai case in Auckland with the Fuller's Ferries, which has basically provided some really good guidance around how decisions are made around concessions. And then the final, the sort of this value here on the slide, again, this really speaks to, this concept of kawa or kawaora, really speaks about, and tupua kawa and tawhito kawa really reflects, some of those physical attributes alongside some of the other broader sort of well-being. And so this really speaks about, basically the biodiversity. It speaks about the health and well-being of the waterways, and that those natural resources upon the maunga. And then again, you'll see there's a key theme here, the linkage back to us as ngā iwi o Taranaki. Now, that's probably important to note here is that, one of the tensions that arises between the Western view of te taiao and conservation versus the Māori worldview is the Western sort of perspective around conservation is really speaks about, separating people from place. And so, you've had previous sort of leadership within the conservation space who are saying, well, actually, there are two-legged predators and, they're people. But from a Māori sort of standpoint, it's really about how we connect and sort of how we strengthen that relationship. Because once you have that relationship, you've got a level of reciprocity around how we look to sort of, carry out our duty and our responsibilities. Next slide.
This particular value, I think, speaks to our worldview around intergenerational commitment and our responsibility and sustainable. I don't know if that's the right word, but sustainability. Yeah. So we wanted to make sure that any activity that does take place needs to be assessed and considered about how a particular activity or proposed activity might contribute towards the ongoing sustainability and vitality of our tupuna. And so, again, we've drawn off some old whakawai where we see the mountain as being a symbol, he puna koro pupu, he manua whenua, that represents the beating heart of the region for the purposes of future generations.
Kia ora he. And I think now we have a little ad break for you, whānau. Oh, we didn't quite manage our ad break.
Short and sweet.
We'll come to our ad break. We'll come back to it at the end, hopefully. So what we've just covered off in that session was the elements under te mana o ngā maunga within that framework. So it all those things we talked about the status of our tupuna, of our maunga as tupuna. It talked about everything to do with the health and well-being. And so now we're sort of moving into the recognising and providing for our relationship as uri with our tupuna. We'll come to some of the questions about tourism, Doc, all of those. So we'll hopefully address some of those questions as we go through the next set of slides. So essentially, maybe Jamie, do you want to lead off on this in terms of the statements?
Yeah. So the key thing here is around this really speaks to our relationship, our connection, and as Liana sort of indicated, how that's being promoted and strengthened through the arrangements. And so there was an opportunity here, he heading up anyway, heading a tangata, so an opportunity for each of the individual iwi to provide statements around particular relationship to the maunga. Just before the Pautupua, the maunga values slide, and I think we've described this through He Kohu Kārio and some of the other fora we've been involved in. We've sort of captured that within these particular statements, and there are three elements to that. Te Pau Whakaruru, which really speaks about the role of our maunga in terms of what they've provided for the region and for us. He Pau Toiora, which speaks about the biodiversity and the rich natural resources that we find on the maunga, and also how the maunga has shaped the landscape, and of course the weather patterns and all of those sorts of aspects. And the final one is He Pau Kura, He Pau Wānanga, which really speaks about how the maunga as identity, how it's shaped our language, our understanding, and when you think about language, very much based on the natural world that we have. And so you see the references to the maunga and all of those elements within our reo, our kōrero whakawai, which you've seen with the Pautupua, the maunga values. So there's that. So that's all-encompassing, and it's really been about being inclusive of all of our iwi. The second point is a standard sort of redress item around just the historical account. So Hemi touched on some of the dates, and then the acknowledgements and the apology. And what we've called that is He Pueatanga ki te ao, which is very much about sort of shining the light on these particular issues, and then providing a platform for future discussion and dialogue around, what that experience has meant. And of course, there are a whole lot of other things around, trauma and disconnection, dislocation, and how we might use that as a means and a foundation of reclamation. We've talked about He Tapanga Wenua, and I think the key thing here is there are other opportunities outside of the settlement that we can sort of look to recognise particular geographic features within Te Kāhui Tupua. And then we'll go into a bit of detail around Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi. So Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi, I think as may have been discussed earlier by Liana, our maunga needs a face and a voice. So someone to be the face and the voice, to speak on behalf of the maunga. And we've called that Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi. Given we're heading into Matariki and Puanga season, Kōkōrangi, of course, sort of speaks about those of our whānau that have expertise in sort of looking to the heavens, to the stars. But the name itself is really talking about how the individuals that will make up Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi need to be very strategic, but also thinking about how they guide, how they chart a course, and are very sort of ambitious moving forward. The other sort of entity here is Te Tōpuni Ngarahu. So one of the aspects of the arrangements is that we need an entity to be able to perform the statutory responsibilities on behalf of us collectively as iwi. And so that's Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, and we'll talk a bit about the functions of that entity. The name, Tōpuni, again, another group, Ngarahu being, the embers. And so when you think about, the role and the responsibilities that we have as iwi, is that very much around maintaining the ahi ka, but also making sure that those embers continue to burn. And so what that sort of means is, it's a very active role, and it's with it comes sort of a lot of responsibility. And then the final point there has been around resourcing. So when we embarked on the negotiations process, the Crown were adamant that no financial resourcing was going to be provided. And so what we've done is we've basically put a case up to say, well, in order for these arrangements to be successful, ngā iwi o Taranaki need to be provided with sufficient financial resource to be able to do the things that need to be done over the longer term. And so Hemi sort of was responsible for basically pulling together some models, and we'll talk a bit about that as we go through. And your question too, Peter, around the role of chair. So if we go to the next slide.
Maybe just
so this one is really just, this is really just to set the context. These are all the components, and we're going to we've talked about the Te Kāhui Tupua piece. So the two grey boxes have been covered off. And then we're going to be focusing here on the right-hand side around the governance arrangements. And then we'll come back, because we've got another copy of this slide later on in the presentation to circle back to.
So in terms of Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi, the role is to act and speak on behalf of Te Kāhui Tupua. So we're creating a legal person, but they can't speak and have a voice for themselves, so we're creating this entity. So the key functions of Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi is to uphold those po tupua, those Maunga values that we went through, uphold the principles of the national park, promote the health and well-being and interests of Te Kāhui Tupua. One of the functions here is to form relationships, not that they need, I guess with iwi and hapu in the first instance, because when we talk about the Maunga values, we're intrinsically a part of that, but also with a number of other agencies that have, whose activities are either within the national park or impact on the national park. But one of the key things that we've been able to negotiate is that Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi, which is the joint governance group, half the membership appointed by the Crown, half appointed by iwi, will develop and recommend for approval the management plan for Te Papakura Taranaki. So in the current regimes, what we have is the Department of Conservation, alongside the Conservation Board, are responsible for preparing that plan. And this is a really key document because, for want of a better phrasing, essentially the plan sets out the do's and don'ts within the national park. So coming back to the tourism point that you raised earlier, Uncle Peter, around how do we manage and control that? So essentially the management plan is the key document that sets out what you can and can't do within the national park. And so being involved for Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi to jointly develop that, essentially, in that process, one planner will be appointed by the Department of Conservation, and one planner will be appointed by ngā iwi. So it will be jointly written and jointly prepared, rather than leaving it all with the Department of Conservation team to develop. So what that means is once that's prepared, the current situation now is that the Minister of Conservation approves the plan. And what we've managed to negotiate is that the Minister of Conservation, alongside Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, which is the representative of the 8 iwi, will jointly approve the plan. So Te Tōpuni Kokorangi will develop it. There'll be 2 planners, one from each side, who help write it up. But the approval of the plan will be by a joint decision between the minister and Te Tōpuni Ngarahu. In terms of our, see your partai there, Uncle Pete's about our tupuna, our chair. So the arrangements that we've got at the moment is the initial chair will be appointed from the members appointed by ngā iwi to Te Tōpuni Kokorangi. And then what where we've landed is post that actually all of the members of Te Tōpuni Kokorangi aren't there to represent the Crown necessarily or represent iwi necessarily. They're there to represent the best interests of Te Kāhui Tupua. And so where we've landed is that actually, if they're all there in the best interests of our tupuna, then that group should be able to appoint their chair, to guide them going forward. I think one of the key aspects in terms of Te Tōpuni Kokorangi, and we've seen it in the Te Awa Tupua arrangements, is that actually it's quite conceivable that the Crown might appoint Māori members to be their representatives on Te Tōpuni Kokorangi, because one of the criteria for sitting on Te Tōpuni Kokorangi is having an understanding of those Maunga values that we've set out. So I think the management plan approval process is a really crucial one for us in terms of what can and can't be conducted in the park. Yeah, James?
I think it's this whole sort of appointment process for Te Tōpuni Kokorangi, we've spent a lot of time sort of working through it. And again, the sort of key objective here, although the Crown are appointing 50% of the board and ngā iwi o Taranaki the other 50, we've been very clear that ultimately these members are there to act in the interest of Te Kāhui Tupua. And so the drafting within the deed basically points to the fact that, both appointers, because the Crown, when looking to appoint or nominate particular persons, need to engage with ngā iwi o Taranaki, and we need to be satisfied that collectively they have, of course, the mana, the standing in the community, the skills and knowledge and experience to be able to discharge that responsibility. But we've actually documented the particular matters that the appointer must have regard to when appointing persons to Te Tōpuni Kokorangi. So there are things of, understanding and knowledge of particular features within Te Papakura o Taranaki, the relationship between ngā iwi o Taranaki and Te Kāhui Tupua, the members' knowledge and understanding of Te Kāhui Tupua, we allowed the Crown to put, because all of those particular criteria very much speak to who we are in our worldview, and then we allowed them to put also the interests of the nature conservation, the interests of nature conservation, I think earth sciences and recreation, tourism and local community. But by and large, when you look across those particular criteria, as Liana has said, it's not inconceivable that, 80, 90% of, or even 100% could be iwi or Māori. And I guess just on that chair piece, where we got to is, thinking about that this group is there to act in the interest of Te Kāhui Tupua, because we're really pushing the Crown to say, well, actually, your people are not representatives of the Crown. You just have the right to be able to appoint people to discharge the responsibilities as the face and the voice. And so that's why, based on that particular logic and that reasoning, it just, in order for our perspective and our logic to sort of stand up, then we were willing to, beyond the first chair, to allow Te Tōpuni Kokorangi to appoint.
Goodbye, Jay.
And I think the only other matter is, I keep sort of repeating this, is what we're what we're negotiating is a framework. And so, you know, once in the event we approve and get this through, I mean, that's where all the work starts, because, you know, fleshing out the management plan, appointing people to tōpuni kōkorangi, you know, that's where all of the work will be done. But what we're doing is providing the frame within these arrangements to make sure that we're sort of protecting the interests of our tupuna maunga, but also the role and function that iwi have in terms of discharging our responsibilities.
Kia ora, Jay. If we can go to the next slide, I think this slide will pick up on a question you had, Chanel, around the ongoing involvement of DOC in these arrangements. So in terms of the national park, it's going to retain the national park status, as I talked about right at the beginning. And DOC and the Director General are going to retain the management responsibility within the national park in terms of the day-to-day operations. So we looked really hard at, because it certainly was an aspiration for iwi to take over operations within the park and to be more involved. And so we looked really hard at that. And I guess two key things kind of changed where we landed on this. The first being that, you know, the significant work that would have to be undertaken to put, or, you know, to take over the operations was, you know, at the day we signed, was almost impossible in terms of, you know, being ready for that to go right from day one. And I guess the second key consideration for us was, because it was going to retain national park status and it was going to retain public access, that there was a significant public liability issue, that if you were the one responsible for the park and the operations, if anything happened to somebody who was any member of the public who was in the park at the time, and there was an incident, then there would be a liability issue. And we didn't think that liability, because it's the Crown's, it was the Crown's preference to retain it as a national park, that we didn't believe that the liability that went with public access sat fairly with the iwi. So where we've landed is that DOC and the Director General will continue to retain the management responsibility, but we are working through locking in, I guess, key opportunities for ngā iwi to be able to undertake some of the management and operations work within the park. Yep. So, yeah, there are mechanisms where the Director General can actually delegate some of that authority, and so we're asking that perhaps that's a mechanism that allows iwi and hapu to undertake work within the park.
Yeah, so we've basically got there's a section within the deed that basically speaks about ngā iwi o Taranaki's aspirations for operational management within Te Papakura o Taranaki. And so that's sort of broken down into the piece that sort of Liana touched on. So how we might grow our capacity and capability to fulfill our particular sort of aspirations around those responsibilities that we might want to fulfill within Te Kāhui Tupua. There's also sort of references around that partnership with DOC on operational matters. And then sort of a third component, which is around particular projects. The other sort of element is that on an annual basis, there's basically a priority setting exercise that involves Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi, but also Te Tōpuni Ngarahu. And so what that will provide is really sort of greater sort of transparency, but also greater input around particular sort of operational sort of activities and prioritization. And we think that's really important when you know, one of those aspects around the concession income. But yeah, so I think, you know, what our view is, we've sort of provided opportunities in the future to be able to work through those aspirations around operational management. There are mechanisms within the deed and the proposed sort of bill which provides the ability for delegation without the liability. But I think very much what we've got to do is take a sort of a medium to longer term view around just working through that, around how we might want to be much more active on Te Kāhui Tupua within Te Papakura o Taranaki. And so I think, there are opportunities there, but we're just taking it as it sort of comes.
Yeah, and I guess the last final point there that we've managed to negotiate is that all of the concession income that's generated within Te Papakura o Taranaki will go back into Te Papakura o Taranaki. So currently concession income, which is around about $1.3 million, near Jamie, that amount of money currently goes back into the central dock pool of funding. And so what we've negotiated is that any money generated from concessions within the national park, within Te Papakura o Taranaki, will stay and be applied to Te Papakura o Taranaki. I just want to pick up on, there was a question earlier, Leonie, about research and I guess rangatiratanga over mātauranga Māori. I guess that's where the management plan, the concession process all ties in with those Maunga values that we talked about, because every concession, every activity and the management plan all have to be consistent with those Maunga values. And I guess it's for someone who, is coming into Te Papakura o Taranaki for a research concession, for example, they're going to have to demonstrate going forward how that research is consistent with those values, and how it's contributing to exactly what you said, that rangatiratanga, or tātou nei mātauranga. So I think that there are some good hooks there in terms of keeping concessionaires and the management plan in regards to research, making sure that those things are highlighted in that. And I just see another question there from you, Uncle Peter, about what if government decides that they want to repeal the Act? The key for us is that the legislation that will be developed for these is essentially a reflection of what we negotiate in the deed of settlement, and they can't repeal the deed of settlement. They can't cancel, or the deed of agreement. They can't cancel those arrangements, and they can't do that without our consent. So, repealing the Act would essentially go against what's in our deed of settlement. So I think we've got a safeguard there.
Yeah, so there's probably further to what Liana sort of stated. I mean, I use the analogy that each of our iwi and Taranaki have now completed historical settlement negotiations, and we have basically a piece of legislation that gives effect to that, by repealing that particular piece of legislation. I mean, they're basically sort of going against what's in the deed between the iwi and the Crown. I think the big issue we have, which we've been working through over the last couple of weeks, and that we'll continue to work through, is it's highly likely within the next period of time that there will be significant reform of all of the conservation legislation. So that's basically the Conservation Act, the National Parks Act, because much of this legislation is outdated now, in terms of where we are today. And so we've been making sure that in the event there is a wider review of national park legislation or the Conservation Act, that there are the right sort of triggers within both the deed and the draft bill, which will be legislation to be able to protect the current position we have around these arrangements. But in the event that there is further advancement of, broader arrangements within the conservation regime, that, we have the ability to be able to extend these arrangements to include any sort of new models, or sort of that evolution of these conservation arrangements. And so, yeah, that's pretty critical. And then really just thinking about one of the other, and there's a slide about this, but also that it's not a tension, but, making sure that, yes, we have the collective elements that are reflected but also there is the ability for individual iwi and hapu to be able to have their own mana motuhaketanga and rangatiratanga around aspects relating to te kawi tupua. So that's another key piece that we've been really strong on. And again, there's particular drafting in the legislation to make sure that the Crown and DOC don't say, well, our Section 4 obligations under the Conservation Act have now been discharged through Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, because they haven't. Te Tōpuni has a role, but there are also sort of obligations to individual iwi and hapu.
That probably nicely leads into the next slide. Jamie, we've talked a little bit about this in terms of the co-drafting of the management plan, the annual business planning or priority setting, but also the opportunity for ngā iwi or Taranaki to participate in operations and contracting. Just off the back of what Jamie said, it's not highly likely, but recent cases that have come out are signalling to us that actually iwi holding concessions within the national park as a priority is essentially where some of that case law is leading us to. And I think it's a really important point for us going forward that, there'll be connections in more ways than just operating. We might be able to be, operational work in terms of conservation mahi, but we will be able to actually undertake activities commercially within the park that, we may not necessarily have had before that. I think just moving on to Te Tōpuni Ngarahu, because I'm conscious of our time and we want to make some time for questions. If we can go to the next slide, please, Mata. And really we wanted to talk about Te Tōpuni Ngarahu Trust, just so that it's really clear to everybody how this will be established. So the 8 runanga kāhui that have gone through the iwi settlements will appoint a trustee each onto Te Tōpuni Ngarahu. So Te Tōpuni Ngarahu will take care of the resourcing that Jamie talked about before, that will help us navigate these arrangements and be able to participate in these arrangements. There'll be it'll have the role of appointing those members to the 50-50 membership to Te Tōpuni Kōkorangi. There'll be some statutory functions and there will be some decision-making functions for Te Tōpuni Ngarahu within the conservation framework, but also there will be accountability. So there'll be audited accounts, annual report, annual plan, all of those things that we that you would expect of our iwi entities. This entity will be responsible for delivering those. I guess the key for us is that because this isn't a treaty settlement like I talked about earlier, that this is a redress mechanism. So it will be the 8 PSGEs essentially that are accountable to all of the members for what happens in this entity. I think that's it. Anything else to add on that entity, Jamie?
No, that's the considerations here that we've had is just ensuring that it's efficient. So we're not wanting to create we're not wanting to burden the group with a whole lot of costs, because ultimately it has its core sort of function, which will be to hold any assets that come over and just fulfill those particular obligations and requirements as part of the arrangements. There is scope, should there be a desire of the collective to do other things with this entity, but very much focused on discharging those particular responsibilities as they relate to the arrangements that we've negotiated, first and foremost.
Ka pai. You go, Jay.
Yeah, we've got this for the avoidance of doubt. I'm just mindful of some of our whānau out there who have, particular views and strong relationships and connections to and on Maunga. again, we don't want, and we've had this in the past with particular entities, we just want to make sure that we remind the Department of Conservation and the Crown, but also remind ourselves that, we don't always have the same views and perspectives, and that should always be the opportunity. And what we are requiring DOC and the Director General to continue to interact with individually and hapu. I know we've got the as appropriate when undertaking operational management planning and activities, but that's one element. The second element, which we haven't talked about tonight, but within the deed around the whole management plan process and concession decision making, we've actually really sort of set out what the requirements are around making sure that through that process, it's a very inclusive process, and there is the level of engagement, not consultation. We're talking about engagement and interaction with our iwi and hapu.
Next. Yep, next slide. Remember at the beginning I talked about, we've been on this journey for 6 years already, and we had a little break in between. And I think the little break, one of the key issues that we couldn't get across the line was the resourcing component. So in all of our 8 iwi deed of settlements, it talks about, we will be collectively negotiating cultural redress for our tupuna. So the Crown's view was that financial and commercial redress had already been provided to each, through each of the iwi settlements. But as Jamie indicated, we came back and said, well, we actually need resourcing to undertake all of the functions that we're negotiating in these arrangements. So we've set out there some of the things. So it won't just be establishing Te Tōpuni Ngārahu and undertaking functions, but a part of the resourcing is also to help that reconnection piece of us as uri to our tupuna. And so there's also an opportunity that Te Tōpuni Ngārahu, there may be some kind of operational project or conservation project that we actually want to undertake independent of what DOC's undertaking. And so, that resource could be used in that respect as well. So I'm not sure, Jamie, about, I think we've talked about it. Yeah. So knowing that it's public and on the radio, but anyway, we initially were offered 9 million. We haggled and came backwards and forwards, and I think where we landed was 20 million. And we decided, and that was our final offer from the Crown, and we decided at that point that amount wasn't enough to make the arrangement sustainable, because all we'd be doing would be spending that 20 million and wouldn't have an opportunity to invest that to enable these arrangements to continue going forward. So we've got to an offer, the Crown offer, and where we've agreed is 35 million is the level of the resourcing that will go along with this package to do all of the things that's set out there on the slide. So that was one component that we had to cover off in these latest kind of negotiations to make sure, that we weren't setting these entities up to fail, I guess. And just picking up on your point there, Leonie, thanks for that. I think we will have a kōrero about that, Jay, in terms of a stronger position over rangahau and the use of mātauranga Māori around the Maunga. So we'll make sure that we can kind of make that stronger and brace the arrangements a little bit better. Yeah.
Yeah, because there are probably, it's a really good point, thanks, Leonie. There are a couple of points around the place and role of mātauranga across all of the arrangements and decision-making, because I think that's one element that we could probably amplify a bit more. there are some pieces around there, sort of the relationship agreement, which I think we could probably bring in the rangahau component. I've seen what haere and others are doing up Ngāti Kuri, so I think some of those elements we could probably bring in the deed, and just make sure that sort of probably post, we've got the right, we've got the linkages in the deed that will provide that platform going forward. So that's really helpful. So I think, Liana, we could probably pull something into the relationship agreement and then potentially have a clause. So we've got, I think as Liana indicated earlier, the use of te kahui tupu as a term. It's been through the sort of IP process, and it's not too dissimilar to the mechanism with parihaka. But even within that, we might be able to broaden out around the whole sort of IP and rangahau piece, or at least the framework, until sort of we determine how that's going to work in practice. But if you've got any particular other examples, Leonie, that would be great.
Cut by. So I think we're going to go back to the slide that we skipped over before. So yeah, Mata, you can take us to the next slide. And this is the overview. Oh, we've got an ad break. We'll come back to our ad break, whānau. Go, Jay.
Yeah, it's always sort of what are we doing here? I mean, effectively, as Liana discussed from the outset, we're negotiating redress, and the redress itself is really sort of creating a new arrangement to guide aspects relating to the Maunga as a whole. And so, one of our objectives has been to shift the way in which the general population sort of view our tupuna, and then sort of bring to life, our worldview, our ways of being and knowing in relation to our tupuna. And so, we've talked about te kahui tupua, so establishing the legal person, and then what the deed basically in the legislation sets out is how you do that. So how you use the legislation, very much similar to Te Urewera and Te Awa Tupua, but again different, because Te Urewera is no longer a national park, and there are slight sort of differences there. And Te Awa Tupua, of course, you're not dealing with, it's slightly different, because that's very much a relationship-based sort of arrangement. And then we've talked about, the taonga tūturu elements, the minerals. So what you'll see, and I caught the back end of the minerals piece, and so we've used all of, kokowai, we've got unewa, kokowa, there's all of those particular minerals. And then and then it also includes, was it building rocks? And yeah, it's quite interesting, because under the Minerals Act, I mean, there are, quarrying, yeah. But when they're a certain size, they sort of fit within the minerals arrangement. But all of those are vested. We've talked about Ngā Pau Tupua in the status statement, and how, where that sits in terms of the hierarchy. The national park remains. We sort of don't use national park anymore. We just call Te Papakura o Taranaki. And then, it sets out there what the management plan arrangements are and the role and function of Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi. The key thing here is actually giving life to this sort of treaty partnership. So the key thing here is, which we had a whole lot of pushback on, is that the management plan is approved by the Minister of Conservation in Ngā Iwi o Taranaki. We had a lot of meetings about this, so because every other management plan is basically developed and recommended by the New Zealand Conservation Authority. And even though the New Zealand Conservation Authority is chaired by one of our whanaunga, Edward Ellison, and we've had really good engagement with the NZCA, who are very supportive of the arrangements we have. We've talked about the operational management, and, the key thing there, whānau, is really what we've done within the context of the arrangements. The goal is always to get a position, but also future-proof, because who knows in 5, 10, 15 years' time, we might be in a different position. So we're just making sure that within these arrangements, there are opportunities to further advance particular aspirations that the whānau might have. We've talked about Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi, and there is really a summary of what the functions are and how the appointments work. The deed basically sets out, and the bill will set out a bit, it's almost like the rules or the constitution of this group. And, and the positive obligations that they have to act in the interest of Te Kāhui Tupua. One of the challenges we've had here is that from the outset, we believe that DOC should not be providing the Secretariat support to Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi. And so they will do the initial sort of Secretariat support, but there is a mechanism to review that, I think, at year 5, Liana? Is it year 5? But again, so, a lot of this, we can't get everything initially, but we're making sure we've got those mechanisms in place to review. And then we've got Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi, and then the other redress, basically the apology, the name change, the resourcing, and then repealing of the Egmont Vesting Act. But I think those are the arrangements. The key thing, though, is, always, because a lot of whānau would say, well, how do I get involved? Well, actually, once these arrangements are set, there are a whole lot of opportunities to get involved across the various arrangements here. And one of the things we've been encouraging people to think about is, future participation in Te Tōpuni Kōkōrangi, or even, Te Tōpuni Ngarahu. What we have there is, the individual iwi will appoint their representatives to that group. And no doubt, and we've just left that kei ia iwi, tōnā ke tikanga, tōnā ke mana mō tērā. So those are the arrangements, whānau, and I think we're going to take questions now, Liana?
I think we're just going to quickly talk about the next steps.
True. Yeah.
So you've seen this slide before. We're at the collective redress step. Maybe if we just go to the next slide, Mata. So we're looking, it's probably early July now, when we're looking to initial the deed of agreement with the Crown. And then from July to October, we'll be undertaking the ratification process. So given that our 8 iwi don't have one single database that we all operate to and utilise, we're going to be running eight or the ratification through the 8 iwi. So that means, Uncle Peter, when you're registered to almost all of the iwi in Taranaki, you will get a vote across each one. We've had lots of questions around, why aren't we just having one person, one vote? But the way that all of our databases are structured, it makes it really difficult to try and reconcile all of that database information, and so where we've landed is that we'll just run it by each iwi, and so there'll be an independent returning officer that will run that process for us, and then we'll get the results according to each of the iwi votes. There'll be a series of information hui pretty similar to this that just steps through all of the arrangements throughout that process from July to October. We're looking to sign at this stage, the dates often change, but we're looking to sign the deed of agreement at the end of this year, in December of this year, and we'll look to have a significant kind of signing event. All going well, we hope to do that, have a big collective event with looking at the introduction of the legislation or the bill in the first quarter of next year. So those are the next steps. Still a few things to tie off. We've got one kind of issue that we're around asset holding that we're still trying to grapple with, but things are looking good, and we've got the historical account apology and acknowledgements. So you'll see those when we go out to ratification. Those will come out along with the translations for you to consider, as well as a part of the package. So I think we're going to go into, we might have our ad break now, and then we'll go into question and answers. But just leading into the ad break, we we know we've come off the back of a big COVID kind of response across our 8 iwi and around the Maunga, across the motu. But just a reminder in terms of winter preparedness, not just COVID vaccinations, but flu vaccinations, all of those. So our iwi hauora providers are still there to help you out, to answer any questions you have in that space. And so we'll go to our ad break, which will take 6 seconds, I'm told, and then we'll come back for Q&A. Kia ora tātou. Voila. So on StreamYard, we can see the questions that you have, and so we've been answering most of them I think all of them as they've been coming up. So really, it's just an opportunity now, if you've got any last questions, to put them up. I know energy levels are low because we've been going for almost 2 hours, but yeah, if you've got anything else, otherwise you can contact any of us, go through our iwi offices. They'll put you in contact with us if you don't have our contact details already, to provide other feedback. And we've got another session again on Thursday night at the same time. It will be the same presentation. So if you just let other whānau know to jump in and have a look at some of that.
So the question here from Will around, it's really the risk and liability associated with an eruption or any particular natural event. The maunga will not be, so there are particular clauses which sort of deal with that, where the maunga, te kahui tupua, will not have any liability. And so we've been really clear within the deed and the legislation to cover that off. Very much in the same vein as, I don't know if many people know this, but ministers and councillors are actually exempt from their health and safety legislative requirements. I don't know if many people know that. But there's also these particular provisions across a number of the areas of responsibility of the Crown. So we're covering that off.
And actually, that's a more general kind of provision too, not just for in the volcanic space, but the Crown will continue to have responsibilities and
liability, right?
Yeah, liability. And the main reason why is because they've insisted that it remains a national park. It's open to public access, so the Crown will continue to have responsibility and liability. Yeah.
Yeah, at an operational level.
Yeah. Ka pai. Kōrero anō.
Ko tai mai te marangai ki pōneke. Tai mai te marangai.
Ka pai chai. O tērā pia mau e whakakapi ake tō tātou nei.
Ka tukuna mahimi. Tikina tērā karakia hemi hei waka mārire mai i ngā huatanga o te rangi.
O kukonei au e noho teko ana me tuku ki au tetehi wāhanga Jamie. Ka pai mākuru anō e waha ake i ngā tino iho o ngā kōrero i tutuki i a tātou i roto i ngā tau. No tāku he whakakapi ake i te ahuatanga i timatai. Hoino, kia puki te ora kia koutou. Tēnei e mihi ake nei mai tēnei tima. Ia kia koutou. Meo koutou kōrero anō ki e tēnei e mihi ake ana. Hoino, kia karakia tātou. E hia te rangi, ia te mana, takapoa te ao, purutia te ao, whakawānangatia ngā kōrero, ngā mai, kia maunga rongo, kia kohaurongo, kia rongo maraira, kia papatūna, ko he takoto nei. E rongo, whakairi i ake kia tīna, hui e tāiki.
Tāiki e.
Kia ora tātou.